Every year, billions of people celebrate Easter. They dye eggs, they bake bread, they go to church, they buy chocolate bunnies that somehow cost $40. And if you ask most of them, where did the eggs come from? What does a bunny have to do with any of this? Why spring? The answer you usually get is a shrug, or a Google search that leads to 3 different Reddit arguments and 0 actual answers. Today, we fix that. This is the real story of Easter. All of it. Where it started, how it grew, and the week in Jerusalem that changed the entire world. We're going to go back, way back, and follow this thing from the very beginning. And I promise you, it is stranger, older, and more human than you were ever taught. Let's go. Let's start with something basic. Spring. For most of human history, and I mean most, like 40,000 years of it, winter was genuinely terrifying. No grocery stores, no heating, no way to know for certain that the cold would ever end. And then it did. Every year, without fail. The sun came back, the ground thawed, things grew again. People noticed this. Obviously, they noticed this, and they celebrated it. With food, with fire, with rituals, with symbols that meant we made it. New life is possible. The world didn't end after all. The egg was one of those symbols. It is, if you think about it, the perfect image of new life. Something that looks completely still and finished, and then, one day, breaks open from the inside. Humans figured this out a long time ago. We're talking ancient Egypt, ancient Persia, Mesopotamia. The tradition of giving decorated eggs in spring is at least 5,000 years old, possibly older. The oldest decorated eggs ever found by archaeologists, 60,000 years old, in Africa, long before any goddess, any church, any chocolate brand with a foil wrapper. Humans just always loved spring, and they always loved eggs. Keep that in mind. Now, into that ancient tradition of spring celebration, enter the gods. Because humans didn't just celebrate spring, they personified it. They gave it a face, a name, a personality. And in the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon world, that face belonged to a goddess named Eostre, sometimes called Ostara. She was the goddess of spring and dawn, of new beginnings, of light returning after darkness. Her sacred symbols, according to the 8th century scholar Bede the Venerable, one of the only people who actually wrote about her, were the hare and the egg. Now here's where it gets interesting. The English word Easter comes directly from her name, Eostre. Easter. That is not a conspiracy, that is not an internet theory, that is just etymology, basic linguistics. Her name is in the holiday's name, in English, to this day. She was celebrated every spring around the equinox, the moment when day and night are exactly equal, and from that point forward, light begins to win. Her followers threw festivals, they decorated eggs, they honored the hare as a symbol of the moon and fertility. Sound familiar? It should.
Here's something they probably didn't teach you in school. Ostara was not unique. The ancient world was full of gods who died and came back to life every single year, like clockwork. Attis, a Phrygian god of vegetation, died every autumn and rose every spring. His cult was celebrated in Rome right around the spring equinox, with 3 days of mourning followed by a day of joy. Sound familiar? Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Dionysus in Greece, all of them followed the same pattern, death in autumn, resurrection in spring. Because that is what nature does every single year. The crops die, the world goes cold, and then, inexplicably, miraculously, reliably, it all comes back. Ancient people weren't stupid. They looked at the world and told stories about it. And the story of death and resurrection was the most obvious story in the world because they watched it happen every year outside their window. This is not me saying all resurrection stories are the same. They're not. The details matter enormously. The meaning is completely different. I'm saying humans have always needed a story about things coming back from the dead, because things do come back from the dead. At least, nature does, every spring, without fail, and we never get tired of that story.
Fast forward a few centuries. The Roman Empire. By the 4th century AD, Christianity had gone from a small, persecuted movement to the official religion of the most powerful empire in the world. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, basically declaring that Christians were no longer going to be fed to anything. And in 325 AD, he called together the Council of Nicaea, one of the most important gatherings in Christian history. On the agenda, theology, doctrine, church organization, and when exactly should Easter be? This sounds like a minor scheduling question. It was not. Different Christian communities across the empire were celebrating on different days. Some followed the Jewish calendar and tied it to Passover. Some calculated it differently. You had pilgrims traveling across the empire and arriving somewhere on Easter Sunday, only to find, sorry, that was last week here. The Council of Nicaea made a decision. Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, which sounds simple until you realize that calculating the exact moment of an equinox using ancient astronomy is genuinely hard, and that different parts of the empire use different lunar calendars, and that this argument would not be fully resolved to this day. Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians still celebrate on different dates because of calculation differences that trace back to exactly this problem.
Now, back to the eggs and the bunny, because I know you're still thinking about it. Here's what actually happened to all those old spring traditions. The church didn't sit down in a meeting and say, let's steal the pagan egg thing. That's not what happened. What happened was, people just kept doing what they'd always done in spring. They dyed eggs because they'd been dyeing eggs for thousands of years. They celebrated the return of light. They made bread. They gathered. And as Christianity spread across Europe, these traditions didn't disappear. They absorbed. They transformed. They picked up new meanings without losing the old ones. The egg, which had always meant new life, now also meant resurrection. The stone rolled away, something breaking open from the inside. The timing of the celebration, always tied to the spring equinox, now carried both the ancient joy of surviving winter and the specific joy of what Christians believed happened in Jerusalem. This is how living traditions work. They don't replace each other cleanly. They layer. And what we call Easter today is one of the most layered things in human culture. 60,000 years of eggs, thousands of years of spring goddesses, 2,000 years of gospel, and whatever your grandmother specifically puts in the Easter basket. All of it real, all of it yours.
Okay, part 2. Before we go in, a note. What I'm about to describe is a story that 2 billion people on Earth consider the most important event in human history. I'm going to tell it straight, with respect, and with the same honesty I'd bring to any story about real humans in an impossible situation. The people in this story were not symbols. They were not Sunday school illustrations. They were frightened, complicated, deeply human people who found themselves in the middle of something they couldn't fully understand. That's actually what makes this story so powerful. It always has been. To understand the last week, you have to understand who Jesus was in the eyes of the people around him. He was a rabbi from Galilee, the northern region of Judea, which the Jerusalem establishment considered something of a backwater. He had no political office, no army, no money. What he had was people. Thousands of them following him across the countryside, listening to him talk for hours, bringing him their sick. He healed people. He fed crowds with almost nothing. He said things that made the powerful deeply uncomfortable, that the last would be first, that the rich would struggle to enter the kingdom of heaven, that religious performance without genuine love was worthless. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. He talked to women as equals when that was genuinely radical. He touched lepers. To ordinary people, he was something they'd never seen before. To the religious establishment, he was a threat, not just spiritually, politically. Judea was occupied by Rome. The last thing the Jewish leadership needed was a popular prophet talking about a coming kingdom. Rome didn't tolerate that kind of language, and if Rome cracked down, everyone suffered. He had to be dealt with. That was the logic. It's always the logic.
It was spring. Passover was approaching, the most important Jewish festival of the year, celebrating the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. Jerusalem was packed. Pilgrims from across the region flooded in. The city's normal population of maybe 40,000 swelled to over 100,000 during Passover week. And into this city rode Jesus on a donkey. The crowd went wild. They threw their cloaks on the road. They cut palm branches and waved them. They shouted, "Hosanna," which means roughly, "Save us." They were treating him like a king making a royal entry. But here's what most of the crowd probably missed. The donkey was not random. The prophet Zechariah, writing 500 years earlier, had described the coming of a king to Jerusalem, humble, riding on a donkey. For anyone who knew that prophecy, and serious students of Scripture did, this was a very deliberate, very loaded gesture. Jesus was not claiming to be a military king who would drive out Rome. He was claiming something more specific, more ancient, more dangerous. And the chief priests watching from the walls understood exactly what he was saying. Thursday evening, an upper room somewhere in the city. Jesus gathered his 12 disciples for a meal, the Passover Seder, the ritual dinner commemorating the liberation from Egypt. They'd done this before, but this one was different, and they could all feel it. Somewhere during that meal, Jesus said something that stopped everyone cold. "One of you will betray me." Imagine that moment. 12 people who had left their jobs, their families, their lives to follow this man for 3 years. 12 people who genuinely believed he was the Messiah. And now, one of you, not someone out there, one of you, at this table, right now. Every single one of them, according to the Gospels, asked, "Is it me? Lord, is it me?" Think about that. Not, "It's obviously not me." Not, "I can't believe someone here would do that." Is it me? As if each of them, in that moment, looked inside themselves and genuinely wasn't sure what they were capable of. That detail has always struck me as one of the most honest things in the entire story. One of them, of course, already knew the answer. Judas Iscariot, the group's treasurer, had already made an arrangement with the chief priests. 30 pieces of silver, the legal price of a slave at the time. Why he did it? Nobody knows for certain. The Gospels don't fully explain it. Maybe he was disillusioned. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought he was forcing a moment of confrontation that Jesus would somehow win. He was wrong. After the meal, Jesus went to pray. The Garden of Gethsemane, just outside the city walls, on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. He took 3 of his disciples with him, Peter, James, and John, and asked them to stay awake, to watch. They fell asleep 3 times. And Jesus prayed alone. The prayer that Luke and Matthew record is remarkable, not for its power, but for its vulnerability. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Not my will, but yours." This is not the prayer of someone without fear. This is someone fully aware of what is coming, fully human in their response to it, and choosing, in that full awareness,
to go through it anyway. When the disciples woke up, it was already too late to matter. Torches were visible through the trees, the sound of soldiers, and Judas walking ahead of them. The signal they'd agreed on was a greeting kiss, the normal way a student addressed a teacher. In that context, in that night, it was the cruelest possible gesture. He walked up to Jesus and said, "Rabbi." And that was that. Of all the stories in that week, Peter's denial might be the one that hits the hardest. Because Peter was, by every account, the most passionate of the disciples, the loudest, the most committed, the one who had said just hours earlier, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you." And he meant it. He absolutely meant it. After Jesus was arrested, Peter followed at a distance to the high priest's courtyard. He wanted to see what happened. He couldn't stay away, which is actually brave in its own way. Everyone else had run. But then, by a fire in the courtyard, someone recognized him. A servant girl, not a soldier, not an official, a servant girl who said, "You were also with that man from Galilee." And Peter said, "I don't know what you're talking about." A second time, "You're one of them." "I am not." A third time, "You have to be. Your accent gives you away." Peter began to call down curses on himself. "I swear I do not know this man." And immediately a rooster crowed. Luke's gospel adds one detail that I think about every time I read this story. At that exact moment, Jesus was being led through the courtyard, and he turned and looked at Peter. No words, just a look. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. He didn't need to be told what he'd done. He already knew. Friday morning. The Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate, was not having a good day, and it hadn't even started yet. The Jewish leadership brought Jesus to him. Under Roman rule, only Rome could carry out an execution, so if they wanted him dead, they needed Pilate's signature. Pilate questioned Jesus, and according to all four Gospels, he found no guilt in him. He tried to release him 3 times in various ways. He offered the crowd a choice. It was a Passover custom to release one prisoner. He gave them the option of Jesus or a man named Barabbas, described as a violent criminal. The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate's response, and this is in Matthew's Gospel, he called for a bowl of water, and he washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood." That gesture, washing your hands of something, entered the English language permanently because of this moment. Pilate invented that idiom on a Friday morning in 33 AD, trying to avoid making a decision that everyone knew he had already made. He signed the order. He didn't want to, but he did. The crowd got what it wanted, and history got the phrase, "washing your hands of it." Some legacies are strange. I'm going to be brief here, not because it isn't important, but because some things don't need commentary. Outside the city walls, a hill called Golgotha, which means in Aramaic, the place of the skull. 3 men were crucified that day, Jesus in the middle. At noon, darkness, 3 hours of it according to the Gospels. At 3 in the afternoon, it was over. A Roman centurion standing guard, a career soldier, a man who had probably presided over dozens of executions, said something that in Luke's account is recorded simply as, "Truly, this man was righteous." The temple curtain, the enormous, heavy curtain that separated the inner sanctuary of the temple, the Holy of Holies, from the rest of the building, tore in 2 from top to bottom. What that meant, what caused it, what it symbolized, people have been discussing for 2,000 years. His followers scattered. Some watched from a distance. The women, notably, stayed closer than the men. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome. They stayed.
3 days, or more precisely, from Friday afternoon to Sunday morning. His followers thought it was over. The disciples were in hiding, behind locked doors, terrified that what had happened to Jesus would happen to them. Everything they had believed, everything they had left their lives for, seemed to have ended on that hill. Sunday, before dawn, the women went to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome. They were going to finish the burial preparations that hadn't been completed before the Sabbath began, a practical task, a last act of care. They found the stone rolled away. They found the tomb empty. And, depending on which gospel account you read, they encountered 1 or 2 figures in white who said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." Mary Magdalene, in John's account, encountered Jesus himself. She didn't recognize him at first. She thought he was the gardener, until he said her name. And then she ran to tell the others, which makes her, by the account of all 4 Gospels, the first person to carry the message that would eventually reach 2 billion people. A woman, in a time and place where women's testimony wasn't considered legally valid. The first witness to the central claim of Christianity was someone the world of her time would have dismissed. That detail has always seemed important to me.
The eggs. Still here. 60,000 years of spring celebration, compressed into a Sunday morning basket with some plastic grass and a chocolate bunny. The date, still argued about, still calculated differently depending on which branch of Christianity you follow. The story, still the most read, most translated, most discussed story in human history. Easter is not one thing. It never was. It is spring and rebirth and the stubborn human insistence that things can come back from the dead. It is an ancient goddess whose name we still use. It is a council of bishops arguing about lunar calendars. It is a woman named Mary who ran to tell people something she'd seen with her own eyes. It is Peter weeping in a courtyard, understanding exactly what he'd done. It is all of these things, layered on top of each other over thousands and thousands of years. And whether you celebrate with church or brunch or just a bag of Cadbury eggs on your couch, you are participating in something genuinely ancient. Something that started when the first human looked at the first decorated egg and thought, this is what hope looks like. Happy Easter. Whatever it means to you, may it be real. If you want to go deeper, every source used in this video is linked in the description. No guessing, no myths, just history. Next week, another story that changed the world, one that also started with a moment nobody fully understood until it was too late. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment. Which part of this story surprised you the most? I read every single one.